The 1959 Tibetan Uprising and 1959 Tibetan Rebellion began on 10 March 1959, when a revolt erupted in Lhasa, the capital of Tibet, which had been under the effective control of the People's Republic of China since the 17-point agreement in 1951. Although the 14th Dalai Lama's flight occurred in 1959, armed conflict between Tibetan rebels and the Chinese army started in 1956 in the Kham and Amdo regions, which had been subjected to socialist reform. The guerrilla warfare later spread to other areas of Tibet and lasted through 1962. The anniversary of the uprising is observed by some Tibetan exiles as the Tibetan Uprising Day. The anniversary of its end is celebrated in Tibet as Serfs' Emancipation Day. Armed resistance in East Tibet. In 1951, a 17-point agreement between the People's Republic of China and representatives of the Dalai Lama was put into effect. Socialist reforms such as redistribution of land were delayed in Tibet proper. However, eastern Kham and Amdo are outside the administration of the Tibetan government in Lhasa, and were thus treated more like other Chinese provinces, with land redistribution implemented in full. The Khampas and nomads of Amdo traditionally owned their own land. Armed resistance broke out in Amdo and eastern Kham in June 1956. Before the communist takeover, the relationship between the Khampa and the Dalai Lama's government had deteriorated badly. As a result, the Khampa were indifferent to the initial communist assault on Chamdo. The PLA had entered Kham without much opposition from a local Khampas. The relationship between the Khampa and the Tibetan Dalai Lama government in Lhasa was extremely poor at the time. Pandit Sang Rapga, a pro-Kuomintang and pro-Republic of China revolutionary Khampa leader, offered the governor of Chamdo, Norbulingka Jigme, some Khampa fighters in exchange for the Tibetan government recognizing the independence of Kham. Narba refused the offer. After the defeat of the Tibetan army in Chamdo, Rapga started mediating in negotiations between the PLA and Tibetan rebels. Rapga and Topga engaged in negotiations with the Chinese during their assault on Chamdo. Khampas either defected to the Chinese PLA forces or did not fight at all. The PLA succeeded in the task. By 1957, Kham was in chaos. Resistance fighters attack and People's Liberation Army reprisals against Khampa resistance fighters such as the Chushi Gang Druk became increasingly brutal. Kham's monastic networks came to be used by guerrilla forces to relay messages and hide rebels. Punitive strikes were carried out by the Chinese government against Tibetan villages and monasteries. Tibetan exiles assert that threats to bomb the Patali Palace and the Dalai Lama were made by Chinese military commanders in an attempt to intimidate the guerrilla forces into submission. Lhasa continued to abide by the 17-point agreement and sent a delegation to Kham to quell the rebellion. After speaking with the rebel leaders, the delegation instead joined the rebellion. Kham leaders contacted the Central Intelligence Agency, but the CIA under President Dwight Eisenhower insisted it required an official request from Lhasa to support the rebels. Lhasa did not act. Eventually the CIA began to provide covert support for the rebellion without word from Lhasa. By then the rebellion had spread to Lhasa, which had filled with refugees from Amdo and Kham. Opposition to the Chinese presence in Tibet grew within the city of Lhasa. In mid-February 1959, the CCP Central Committee's administrative office circulated the Xinhua news agency internal report on how the revolts in the Tibetan region have gathered pace and developed into a nearly full-scale rebellion. in their situation report for top CCP leaders. When Mao Zedong read it on the 18th of February, he commented, "The more chaotic in Tibet becomes the better, for it will help train our troops and toughen the masses. Furthermore, will provide us sufficient reason to crush the rebellion and carry out reforms in the future." Quote. The next day, the Chinese leader saw a report from the PLA General Staff's Operations Department describing rebellions by Tibetans in Sichuan, Yunnan, Gansu, and Qinghai. He again stressed that rebellions like these are extremely favorable for us because they will benefit us in helping to train our troops, train the people, and provide sufficient reason to crush the rebellion and carry out comprehensive reforms in the future. The PLA used Chinese Muslim soldiers who formerly had served under Ma Bufang to crush the Tibetan revolt in Amdo, in southern Kham, Hui cavalry were stationed. Lhasa Rebellion. On the 1st of March 1959, an unusual invitation to attend a theatrical performance at the Chinese military headquarters outside Lhasa was extended to the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama, at the time studying for his Lhasa degree, initially postponed the meeting, but the date was eventually set for the 10th of March. On the 9th of March, the head of the Dalai Lama's bodyguard was visited by Chinese army officers. The officers insisted that the Dalai Lama would not be accompanied by his traditional armed escort to the performance, and that no public ceremony for the Dalai Lama's procession from the palace to the camp should take place, counter to tradition. According to historian Tsering Shakya, the Chinese government was pressuring the Dalai Lama to attend the National People's Congress in April 1959, in order to repair China's image with relation to ethnic minorities after the Khampas Rebellion. On the 7th of February 1959, a significant day on the Tibetan calendar, the Dalai Lama attended a religious dance, after which the acting representative in Tibet, Tan Guanzan, offered the Dalai Lama a chance to see a performance from a dance troupe native to Lhasa at the Norbulingka to celebrate the Dalai Lama's completion of his Lhasa degree. According to the Dalai Lama's memoirs, the invitation came from Chinese General Chiang Ching-wu, who proposed that the performance be held at the Chinese military headquarters. The Dalai Lama states that he agreed. The planned performance date of the 10th of March was only finalized 5 days beforehand, on the 5th of March. Neither the Kashag nor the Dalai Lama's bodyguards were informed of the Dalai Lama's plans until Chinese officials briefed them on the 9th of March, one day before the performance was scheduled, and insisted that they would handle the Dalai Lama's security. The Dalai Lama's memoirs state that on the 9th of March the Chinese told his chief bodyguard that they wanted the Dalai Lama's excursion to watch the production conducted in absolute secrecy, and without any armed Tibetan bodyguards, which all seemed strange requests, and there was much discussion amongst the Dalai Lama's advisors. Some members of the Kashag were alarmed and concerned that the Dalai Lama might be abducted, recalling a prophecy that told that the Dalai Lama should not exit his palace. According to historian Tsering Shakya, some Tibetan government officials feared that plans were being laid for a Chinese abduction of the Dalai Lama, and spread word to that effect amongst the inhabitants of Lhasa. On the 10th of March, several thousand Tibetans surrounded the Dalai Lama's palace to prevent him from leaving or being removed. The huge crowd had gathered in response to a rumor that the Chinese communists were planning to arrest the Dalai Lama when he went to a cultural performance at the PLA PLA's headquarters. This marked the beginning of the uprising in Lhasa, though Chinese forces had skirmished with guerrillas outside the city in December of the previous year. Although CCP officials insisted that the reactionary upper stratum in Lhasa was responsible for the rumor, there is no way to identify the precise source. At first, the violence was directed at Tibetan officials perceived not to have protected the Dalai Lama to be pro-Chinese. Attacks on Hans started later. One of the first casualties of mob was a senior Lama, Pagbalaswan Mgmko, who worked with the PRC as a member of the preparatory committee of the Tibetan Autonomous Region, who was killed and his body dragged by a horse in front of the crowd for 2 kilometers. On the 12th of March, protesters appeared in the streets of Lhasa declaring Tibet's independence. Barricades went up on the streets of Lhasa, and Chinese and Tibetan rebel forces began to fortify positions within and around Lhasa in preparation for conflict. A petition of support for the armed rebels outside the city was taken up and an appeal for assistance was made to the Indian consul. Chinese and Tibetan troops continued moving into position over the next several days, with Chinese artillery pieces being deployed within range of the Dalai Lama's summer palace, the Norbulingka. On the 15th of March, preparations for the Dalai Lama's evacuation from the city were set in motion, with Tibetan troops being employed to secure an escape route from Lhasa. On the 17th of March, 2 artillery shells landed near the Dalai Lama's palace, triggering his flight into exile. On the 19th of March, the Chinese started to shell the Norbulingka, prompting the full force of the uprising. Combat lasted only about 2 days, with Tibetan rebel forces being badly outnumbered and poorly armed. 2 British writers, Stuart and Roma Gelder, visited the Chensel Phodrang Palace in the Norbulingka in 1962 and found its contents meticulously preserved. They did not claim that the Norbulingka had not been damaged. United States involvement. The United States funded training and arms for the guerrillas in Tibet prior to the uprising and for several years following. From 1959 to 1964, Tibetan guerrillas were secretly trained at Kampale by the Central Intelligence Agency. The Tibetan project was codenamed St. Circus, and it was similar to the CIA operation that trained dissident Cubans in what later became the Bay of Pigs invasion. In all, around 259 Tibetans were trained at Kampale. Some were parachuted back into Tibet to link up with local resistance groups. Others were sent overland into Tibet on intelligence gathering missions, and yet others were instrumental in setting up the CIA-funded Tibetan resistance force that operated out of Mustang, in northern Nepal. Republic of China involvement and position on Tibetan independence. Pandit Sangrapgar, a pro-Kuomintang and pro-Republic of China revolutionary Khampa leader, was instrumental in the revolt against the communists. The Kuomintang had a history of using Khampa fighters to oppose both the Dalai Lama's Tibetan government and battled the Communist Red Army. Rapgar continued to cooperate with the ROC Kuomintang government after it fled to Taiwan. They provided training to Khampa rebels against the Communist PLA forces. The Republic of China on Taiwan disputed with America whether Tibet would be independent, since the ROC claimed Tibet as part of its territory. Rapgar agreed to a plan in which the revolt against the communists would include anti-feudalism, land reform, a modern government, and to give power to the people. The Republic of China continued to claim Tibet as an integral part of its territory in accordance with its constitution, contrary to the claims of the Dalai Lama's Central Tibetan Administration, which claimed Tibetan independence. After the 1959 Tibetan Rebellion, Chiang Kai-shek announced in his letter to Tibetan friends that the ROC's policy would be to help the Tibetan diaspora overthrow the People's Republic of China's rule in Tibet. The Mongolian and Tibetan Affairs Commission sent secret agents to India to disseminate pro-Kuomintang and anti-communist propaganda among Tibetan exiles. From 1971 to 1978, the MTAC also recruited ethnic Tibetan children from India and Nepal to study in Taiwan, with the expectation that they would work for a ROC government that returned to the mainland. In 1994, the Veterans Association for the Tibetan guerrilla group Chushi Gang Druk met with the MTAC and agreed to the KMT's One China principle. In response, the Dalai Lama's Central Tibetan Administration forbade all exiled Tibetans from contact with the MTAC. Tibetans in Taiwan, who are mostly of Kham origin, support the Republic of China's position that Tibet is part of the ROC, and are against both the Tibetan exile community in India who live under the Tibetan government in exile and the communists in mainland China. The Taiwanese Tibetans are considered traitors by the TGE for their position. Comment by the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union offered moral support to the Tibetan rebels, saying that theirs was a legitimate grievance against the Chinese casualties. The Tibetan government in exile reports variously 85,000, 86,000, and 87,000 deaths of Tibetans during the rebellion, attributed to secret Chinese documents captured by guerrillas. Tibetologist Tom Grunfeld said, "The veracity of such a claim is difficult to verify." Warren W. Smith, a writer with Radio Free Asia, writes that the secret documents came from a 1960 PLA report captured by guerrillas in 1966, with the figures first published by the TGIE in India in 1990. Smith states that the documents said that 87,000 enemies were eliminated, but does not take eliminated to mean killed, as the TGIE does. A Tibetan government in exile official surnamed Samdup released a report for Asia Watch after 3 fact-finding missions from 1979 to 1981, stating that a speech by Premier Zhou Enlai, published in Beijing Review in 1980, confirmed the 87,000 figure. Demographer Yan Hao could find no reference to any such figure in the published speech, and concluded, if these TGIE sources are not reluctant to fabricate Chinese sources in open publications, how can they expect people to believe in the citations of so-called Chinese secret internal documents and speeches that are never available in originals to independent researchers? Aftermath. Lhasa's 3 major monasteries, Sira, Ganden, and Drepung, were seriously damaged by shelling, with Sira and Drepung being damaged nearly beyond repair. According to the TGIE, members of the Dalai Lama's bodyguard remaining in Lhasa were disarmed and publicly executed, along with Tibetans found to be harboring weapons in the homes. Thousands of Tibetan monks were executed or arrested, and monasteries and temples around the city were looted or destroyed. The CIA officer, Bruce Walker, who oversaw the operations of CIA-trained Tibetan agents, was troubled by the hostility from the Tibetans towards his agents. The radio teams were experiencing major resistance from the population inside Tibet. Quote, "The CIA trained Tibetans from 1957 to 1972 in the United States and parachuted them back into Tibet to organize rebellions against the PLA. In one incident, one agent was immediately reported by his own brother and all 3 agents in the team were arrested. They were not mistreated. After less than a month of propaganda sessions, they were escorted to the Indian border and released. In April 1959, a 19-year-old Choka Gyaltsen, 10th Panchen Lama, the second-ranking spiritual leader in Tibet, residing in Shigatse, called on Tibetans to support the Chinese government. However, after a tour through Tibet, he wrote a document in May 1962 known as the 70,000-character petition addressed to Zhou Enlai criticizing Chinese abuses in Tibet, and met with Zhou to discuss it. The petition outline dealt with the brutal suppression of the Tibetan people during and after the PRC's invasion of Tibet and the sufferings of the people in the Great Leap Forward. In this document, he criticized the suppression that the Chinese authorities had conducted in retaliation for the 1959 Tibetan Uprising. But in October 1962, the PRC authorities dealing with the population criticized the petition. Chairman Mao called the petition a poisoned arrow shot at the party by reactionary feudal overlords. Quote, in 1967 the Panchen Lama was formally arrested and imprisoned until his release in 1977. Chinese authorities have interpreted the uprising as a revolt of the Tibetan elite against communist reforms that were improving the lot of Tibetan serfs. Tibetan and third-party sources, on the other hand, have usually interpreted it as a popular uprising against the alien Chinese presence. Historian Tsering Sheikhu has argued that it was a popular revolt against both the Chinese and the Lhasa government, which was perceived as failing to protect the authority and safety of the Dalai Lama from the Chinese.